The Ottoman rulers had long stacked up titles for themselves. Khan, which is Turkish for emperor. Shahi Shah, Persian for king of king. And Sultan, the Arabic word for ruler. But now, with all the former Byzantine Empire under their command, Mehmet and his successors claimed yet another title, Holy Roman Emperor. The Ottomans had reached the gates of the West and were poised to push on towards what they now claimed as their ultimate destiny, the conquest of Europe. That quest would fall to the most legendary sultan of all. He was born at the beginning of the 10th century by the Muslim calendar, and he was the 10th sultan descended from Osman. He was a child of destiny, whose greatness was expected. His name was Suleiman, after Solomon, the wise king of the Old Testament. The Ottoman Empire would reach its apex under Suleiman's reign. As a young prince, he formed a relationship that would have a tremendous impact on his life and on the empire as well. Suleiman was 26 when he took the throne, determined to make his mark on the world. As soon as his ministers would let him, the way to prove his mettle was on the battlefield. Every new sultan was expected to begin his reign by expanding the empire. Ottomans now controlled Kurdistan, Egypt, and the holiest cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina. Suleiman set his sights on Belgrade in Hungary, the stepping stone to Europe. A year later, he turned his ambitions on the island of Rhodes. The tiny island was a troublesome outpost of Christianity in an otherwise Ottoman sea. It was also a haven for pirates, preying on Muslim trade ships. The 50,000 defenders of Rhodes manned one of the strongest forts in the world. Suleiman decided on a tactic other than relying on gunfire from his huge cannons. A new tactic, seldom used until that time. Ottoman sappers dug out a series of 50 tunnels near the base of the fort, so they could mine its foundations. Performing this dangerous work were expendable Christian conscripts from the Balkans. The resulting explosion signaled a furious 6-hour Ottoman assault. But the Turks were beaten back. Then, after 145 days of siege, the exhausted Christian defenders finally negotiated a truce. The Ottomans had won. Victory did more than deliver Rhodes to the empire. Suleiman was now a sultan to be taken seriously. His march of conquest had begun. Europe grew to fear the name of Suleiman. But within his own borders, he had another reputation. Islamic history remembers him as Kunan, the lawgiver. Under Suleiman, a single legal system was defined for the sprawling empire. His laws would later become the basis of constitutions for several other nations. He inaugurated a classical age in Ottoman architecture, commissioning some of the most spectacular buildings the world has ever seen. Suleiman's chief architect, Sinon, was a man whose vision perfectly complemented the empire builder. Sinon perfected the signature structure of Islam, the domed mosque. His career spanned half a century and produced well over 300 buildings, including the refurbishment of one of the most important monuments in Islam, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. In the spirit of Muhammad's teaching, the Great Mosque was a center of social services, complete with a hospital, school, and library. At its inauguration, it's said Suleiman gazed at it with awe and exclaimed, "O Solomon, I have surpassed thee." No less impressive was Suleiman's palace. Topkapi was both the seat of government and his private dwelling. In public, Suleiman required that all those around him remain completely silent, while he made his wishes known with the slightest nod or gesture. As Suleiman's power grew, his lifelong friend Ibrahim rose in the court structure. Ibrahim campaigned with his own army, growing in influence and ambition, till his power was second only to Suleiman's. But for power and ambition, the secret world of the Sultan's harem had no equal. Contrary to the Western stereotype, it was not the Sultan's playpen, but lay at the center of dynastic power. Islam allowed the Sultan 4 wives and many concubines. With his first wife, Suleiman had a son and heir, Mustafa. But while he was in his mid-30s, the Sultan fell deeply in love with a Slavic slave girl named Hurrem. In the West, we know her by a different name, Roxolana. Roxolana would bear him a rival heir and become Suleiman's most trusted confidant. Suleiman groomed his firstborn son Mustafa for power. In the Ottoman tradition, the young prince entered the military and quickly won recognition as a talented general. Mustafa was clearly the heir apparent. For Suleiman, the future of his empire seemed limitless. "I am God's slave and Sultan of this world," Suleiman would carve on a conquered fortress. "I am Suleiman, in whose name the Friday sermon is read in Mecca and Medina. In Baghdad, I am the Shah. In the Byzantine realms, I am the Caesar. And in Egypt, the Sultan." One of Suleiman's greatest rivals was to the east, the empire of the Persian Safavids. This was a Muslim enemy whose rival creed made them fierce antagonists of the Ottomans for centuries. The Safavid dynasty was Shiite Muslims, bitter rivals to the Sunni Ottomans. This challenge to legitimacy is the basis of the Shiite-Sunni split, a bitter division that still separates the Muslim world to this day. The Safavid military was formidable, but there were cultural rivals to the Ottomans as well. In the soaring palaces of the Safavid Shahs, murderous intrigues against Suleiman and his dynasty were hatched that would reach into his very household. But Suleiman's eyes were on the west, where a fragmented and vulnerable Europe awaited his conquest. The Ottoman Empire encompassed everything from Egypt to Kurdistan, and he now had Hungary as well. Suleiman's next step would be Vienna. Its conquest would drive a dagger into the heart of the European Habsburg Empire and open the way to the west. But as the heavily armed Ottomans set out for Vienna, the weather turned against them. The heavy cannon that had swept the Ottomans to victory after victory bogged down in the mud. Suleiman had to move on without them. With only light artillery, the Ottomans relentlessly shelled the city. But the smallest breach was ferociously defended. After a lengthy siege, with winter fast approaching, Suleiman withdrew his forces. He was not concerned. He was sure he would return soon enough. He never did. But Suleiman had little to fear from Europe. Rival Muslim Safavids and his own family would bring the cruelest of sorrows to the Sultan, and ultimately to his empire as well. In the power-laden world of the Sultan's household, the intrigues never ceased. Now Hurrem was at the center of power, promoting her own son as heir apparent and immersing herself in a web of deadly gossip and suspicion. On March 15th, 1536, Suleiman and Ibrahim Pasha dined together, as was their custom. In the morning, Ibrahim's body was found, strangled. But Suleiman's desolation and loss had only begun. A few years after Ibrahim's death, Hurrem claimed to have uncovered a plot to overthrow Suleiman, devised with Safavid help by his beloved firstborn son and heir, Mustafa. Without hesitation, Suleiman ordered Mustafa's execution, then sat by the young man's body for days, refusing to allow anyone to touch him. The best hope for the empire's future was dead. When Hurrem herself died the following year, Suleiman fell deeper into despair, finding solace in his poetry. Even if your reign on the imperial throne seems everlasting, don't be taken in. One day a hostile wind will blow and bring to your land of beauty heaven's misfortune and deepest suffering. In all his loneliness, there was only one refuge for the Sultan whose power, like his sorrow, seemed limitless. He returned to the field of battle, to the work of conquest. In 1561, the man who had ruled the empire longer than any other died in his grand war pavilion, surrounded by his generals. He was 67. No Ottoman Sultan would ever achieve his greatness again. The nexus of world power would move from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean and the New World, slowly leaving the Ottomans behind.